Hello, everybody. Thanks again for joining us for another edition of Spincast here at Stay Plugged In. Very excited about the guest we have on tap for today, CAROLAYNE Henry. She's joining us from the Mountain West Conference. She is the Senior Associate Commissioner, as well as the Primary Esports Administrator for the Mountain West. CAROLAYNE, I hope you are doing well today. Thank you so very much for joining us. And as we start with each Spincast, if you would just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, really how you transitioned into the esports side of things, and we can start from there.
All right. And first of all, thanks for having me. And it's always exciting for me to talk about esports. So as Rick said, CAROLAYNE Henry, Mountain West Conference. I'm Senior Associate Commissioner, and I am the primary for our esports here at our league. I do a number of other things, but esports is something that was relatively new for me about 3 years ago. And to give you an idea how we started, this actually was the brainchild of our conference presidents. And we were at a board of directors meeting, and one of the presidents brought up esports and whether or not our conference should explore it. And our board said, absolutely. It's a segment of our student body that we want to make sure that we communicate with. And we want to know what they're doing as well. So it's not always just about conventional athletics. So I knew nothing about it. I did some research, had a couple contacts, and then I called everybody that I could imagine that could help me through this. Because in addition to exploring esports, and this was, I think it was December 2017, our board said, not only should you explore it, but also, how about let's have an event in March, about 2.5 months from now. And they asked if I could do that. And I was like, absolutely. So we got our first event started with Boise State University and UNLV, and we played 3 games. And basically it was an exhibition. And we called it a showdown. And that was basically the beginning of Mountain West Esports. So we started with 2 teams. The following year we had 10 teams, and we played 1 game. That game generated sponsorships as well as scholarship dollars for the winning team. So we had a sponsor donate scholarship dollars to the winning team. They can put it toward their scholarship program. And then this past year, right before all of the COVID-19 happened, we had what is really our 3rd competition. We started out the season with 12 teams. We had a regular season. We brought, in 2 different games, we brought the finalists to Las Vegas for an in-person competition. And then each of the winners also got scholarship money to go toward their scholarship program. So that's kind of how we started. Along the way, I've started to learn about the games. I've started to play a little bit of the games because I need to know what the content is. But mostly what I see from our students are competitors. Just like with conventional athletics, they compete hard, they train, they study, they do everything else that your other student athletes on your campuses do. So that's kind of my take on it. I'll stop there, turn it back over, and I guess we'll start some questions.
No, that's awesome. You got literally thrown into the fire. Let's head it up, and then 3.5 months later, you're out at your first event. That's fantastic. So talk a little bit about one of the things you mentioned, the Las Vegas event. I think for a number of parents that may be watching, their normal thought process with esports, video games, is they picture their kid probably in a dorm room, playing a game against another school, those types of things, when nothing could be further from the truth. Just in being able to talk to a number of schools, obviously they have practice facilities, things of that nature, et cetera. But being able to go on campus, off campus over to Las Vegas to compete as a conference, how did that shape up and how did that work itself out? And most importantly, what do you think the students got out of that?
First of all, it worked out really well. One of the things I think, and it's a misconception I think about esports, is that you're, alone in your basement playing a game, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. This is a team competition. Mm-hmm. So we had competitors competing against each other in a team setting, and it just happened to be in person. What we tried to do from the Mountain West was to make it feel as much like any of our other championships as possible. So you had participation gifts, you had trophies, you had plaques, different things were awarded, the scholarship dollars, as I noted. So we wanted it to feel like a real competition environment. And so we hired a company that helped us broadcast it on Twitch, the 9. One of the things that I noted from our very first competition was the feeling of team and feeling of being associated with their institution and their conference. And that to me was probably one of the most valuable things that I saw, because here you have, you know, Boise State and UNLV. We had fans from each one of those schools come. They had no idea what they were watching, but they were cheering on their team, and that made the competitors feel that much more included in their campus environments.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And that's something we try to stress here at the lower school levels, is simply to have that backing, if you will, but from the family side of things, you know, to take a moment to listen and see what it is that they're interested in, and back that, because there's so many opportunities out there right now. You talked about one in particular that I think is fantastic. There was the ability to go to the competition and compete, but also to walk away with scholarship dollars for those institutions. Are you seeing more and more monies generated for scholarships within your conference as the years progress, as the seasons go on?
This was the second year we had scholarship dollars, and it was a joint effort between the Mountain West and our third-party licensing arm. And, you know, my goal was to at least have something for our participants. I don't know that it's widespread across conferences. It's absolutely something that we will continue to try to do. But the main thing too is to show our high school students that there is a place for them at our schools. Just because you don't play baseball or basketball doesn't mean that there's not something that you can contribute to your campus environment. During our competition this year, one of our participants brought his whole family, basically, and I had a chance to speak to his parents, and they said to me, "We have no idea what's going on, but he's really good at it, he loves it, and he's a great student." So I was like, well, that's awesome. Would you do an interview, you know, with some of our casters? And so his mom did an interview, and she's so excited, and just the joy on their faces, that alone was priceless.
Yeah, no doubt. And you bring up an interesting point, because a number of people play sports, but most people are limited as to how high they can jump, or how well they can shoot a basket, or how hard they throw a baseball, how they can throw a football, etc. But if you look at the numbers out there, the sheer numbers, pretty much everyone can play a video game, and probably does, especially now as the country's been kind of on lockdown. It's not only a social outlet, but it's entertaining. And to be able to go on campus and to be part of that community and really bought in, I think is critical. So talk a little bit about the growth aspect, what you saw from the first year within the conference in terms of how many teams, how many participants, et cetera, to where it is today. I would suspect it's probably grown by comparison.
Yeah, and I don't have a particular number, but I can tell you we went from 2 teams to 12 teams in basically 3 years. And once other institutions within the conference found out what we were doing, and they saw what we were doing with esports, they were really interested in putting their teams together. And so we had first-time teams that, in my mind, did a really good job of getting their team together, having them play collectively as a team, and they being a part of our conference competition. So I think there's a lot of interest out there. I don't know that folks know where they can plug in. And that's where, from a conference perspective, we've been trying to help our schools say, if you have students who are interested, here are some ways that you can get them to come out and perhaps play, and maybe even be on your teams.
If you could take that one step further, for high school students that may be watching this, that are obviously interested now in pursuing more with the Mountain West in respect to esports, how can they find out more about the schools, what they have to offer, things of that nature? How can they find out more?
I would say for high school students to directly contact the institutions that you're aware of. And usually, at least with our schools, you will be able to find an esport contact. That was one of the things that I did early on. Initially, the esport contacts had been student participants, and they had been the student leaders on campus. One of the things we established was to have an adult non-student administrator kind of oversee the esport program, so that we could bring more students in. You could also go to our website and look at our, we have a Twitch page as well, and we have esports on our Mountain West Conference website, and you can do a little exploration there about our esport programs.
Fantastic. Now, earlier, as we started the conversation, you mentioned that you started to dabble into looking at some of the video games yourself from a content perspective. So certainly I know a number of parents would probably say, well, those games are violent or this. Tell me what you found just by going into it yourself and being able to watch some of the activities and some of the events that happen within the Mountain West.
I mean, what I was seeing was just competition. And, when we selected our games, and our board was very specific that they did not want first person shooter games. And so when you play games like Overwatch or League of Legends, that's where you look at the content and the language of the content. And then the developers have been really good at working with us with any concerns that we may have. But what I found was just a competition and a particular team having a goal in each one of those games. Obviously, that goal was to win, but our board was comfortable with the selections that we've made. We've had some questions from some of our student participants as to whether or not we would consider other games. Right now, not at this time. The third game we play is Rocket League, which even for someone like me who just started out in esports, I could figure that one out, soccer in a car. But, we're really keen on going back in, looking at the content, raising questions to the developers and asking them if they could address some things.
So when you were first tasked initially with really supporting and being that primary esports administrator for the league, what were some of your biggest challenges? What were some of the things early on that you look back on now and says, wow, that was a pretty big hurdle or obstacle we had to overcome?
One of the biggest things, and this had to do with our in-person event, was to figure out, one, what did I need for that event? When you think about video games, at least from my perspective, when I was growing up, we had to go to an arcade. We didn't play video games in the basement. Then there was Pong. And so, learning all the technology about video games now, how to get the equipment that we needed for our event, what actually was needed in a telecast, how we worked with Twitch and establishing that relationship. I didn't know any of that. And so I was learning as I went along, but the hardest part was just getting everything we needed for that first competition. And we probably were maybe 4 weeks out, and I still didn't have somebody to broadcast it for me. And then I got a good partner in eStars who's been with us for the last 3 years.
Got it. And talk a little bit about, for the students that are engaged in esports, obviously, just like any sport, you would love to see them go to that professional level, just like if it was a baseball player, a soccer player, etc. But in my opinion, anyway, from the little history I have with esports, there are so many different career paths that can be opened through esports. So talk a little bit about that, what you see for the future for some of the students that are currently engaged within the Mountain West with esports.
Sure. This isn't dissimilar from what I see from our conventional athletes. I mean, the majority of them are not going pro. And to me, the premise, whether it's esports, conventional athletics, if you have an opportunity to have part of your education paid for, or, all of it in some cases, use that as an opportunity for your education. If you happen to go pro, that's great. But what we see with our esport participants, the majority of them are in STEM majors. Some are not, but the majority of them are. And there's a great demand for those types of minds when they graduate from university. So I would say the educational component is first and foremost. Professional aspirations are great. Professional options are great. But I would emphasize that the students should be there to get their education, and anything else is gravy.
Yeah, no, definitely understood. And you can speak on that from experience. Again, we're with CAROLAYNE Henry, the Senior Associate Commissioner for Mountain West. If you guys have a minute watching or listening, take a moment to look at her biography. It would be an entire separate podcast just to go over all of that in particular, but she's done quite a number in her career. So talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, what you see or what you envision for the conference in esports specifically over the next few years. Obviously, you've had such tremendous growth in a short amount of time, right? 2 teams to 12. How does that continue to work? More expansion, more facilities potentially on campus? How do you think it will all come together, say, over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, and honestly, we look at it on a year-to-year basis. One is we have a collective of teams, and they all are within the Mountain West Conference. They all play conventional sports in the Mountain West. Now that we have that framework set up, what I'd like to see and what our schools are starting to do is share information with one another about how to diversify their teams. There's a stereotype that, all gamers are, from a certain demographic. And what we're seeing is the more organized the programs are, the more diverse the programs are. Boise State, for example, their Overwatch captain is a woman. And she's extremely smart and also very talented at Overwatch. But what I'd like to see is just involvement of more students from different backgrounds who also play video games and also have an interest. The other thing I would like to see is esports become more mainstream. Now some folks they say, oh, what is that? Well, it's something that a good number of people in our country do, and I would like it to be more mainstream, not just in the Mountain West, but in the country as well.
So how do you see the landscape collegiately? Obviously, there's no real governing body per se. There's not NCAA supervision over esports. Would you like there to be? Would you like something else to happen? Just your thoughts, again, as we expand over the next few years. What could help this esports grow?
I think, consistency in a few rules would be helpful for esports, namely eligibility, some recruiting, because we actually do have some recruiting shenanigans going on.
Uh-oh.
It's a little bit different than conventional sports, talking about intellectual property. And so if the developers would come together and agree to have a common set of very basic rules, I think that would be helpful for esports generally, if you were looking at an NCAA type model. If not, each of the developers has their own set of rules that institutions will follow, and it's a matter of educating institutions on the games that they select. And which games stay around the longest would probably give you an idea what games are going to, last over time. Basketball's not owned by anybody, baseball's not owned by anybody, but the games are. And so the dilemma is how to work with all the different developers of the games and make it a little more mainstream collectively. Yeah,
no doubt about it. I think that's, we're all hopeful. I think I've heard that message loud and clear a few different times, and I think we're all hopeful that that certainly comes to fruition. So, as I mentioned to you at the outset, prior to getting on the podcast, our audience predominantly is going to be the high school and middle school student, as well as parents for them. If you could give them a message, obviously this is still somewhat new to you too, in respect to how long you've been in this esports world, but obviously you've learned so much just through experience, certainly, but you've probably been able to see so much in terms of positives for students. So if you could share some advice or some things that you have seen for these parents and for these high school students that are watching, share some of that.
Sure. Like I said, one of the first things that I saw is that sense of belonging and attachment to their school. When fans from a particular school come out and cheer for that student, then they feel like, I go to UNLV, I go to Colorado State, or, whichever school you go to, and you feel like you belong to that. The other option is that just the teammates that you meet. It's not, again, dissimilar from my teammates that I met for basketball. These are probably going to be lifelong friends. You'll continue to communicate with them long after your college days. And back to the educational component. Just an opportunity to get an education in a different environment, perhaps than, your home if you go away, whether it's an hour or two or, across the country. Those are all positives. And I think that the administrations are starting to view it more positively. But just like anything, the harder you work, the more opportunity you create for yourself. And whether you're on a keyboard with a mouse or you're bouncing a basketball, it's still hard work. And I would say just continue that, and it will pay off.
Yeah, no doubt. And let me just make a distinction with the Mountain West. The schools that they have that participate in esports are really leading the wave, if you will, in terms of their competitiveness and how well they do nationally. I think a lot of parents look at video games or esports the same, when really they're different. Video games, I may do that just casually because my friend is on and I want to be able to talk to them and play a game with them. Where with esports, you're training, you're dieting correctly, right? You're exercising. Yep. You're taking the time to make sure that you can compete at an incredibly high level against a number of the other institutions within the Mountain West because it's super competitive there. And if you're good enough and you're able to get on that campus, then that is a brotherhood or a sisterhood that's created within those team environments. So there's certainly a differential. And I always find myself saying video game versus esport when esports is a whole different animal. And I think it's important for the parents to understand that it's really a cool development, if you will, that has occurred over the years because it's always been around, but now it's really starting to blossom and take fruition. I think the neatest part for folks like you that are in the positions you're creating those opportunities for the future generations that are going to come through this, is you kind of learn by fire a little bit as you go through it because it is relatively new. So talk a little bit, last question for you, and I'll let you go. Talk a little bit about what you would like to see nationally on the esports stage as we progress. If you could look into a crystal ball and say 5 years from now, this is ultimately what I'd like the landscape of esports to look like at a national level, what would that be?
From a national perspective, it would be nice to see institutions and conferences on a consistent basis having esport programs.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure who that governing body would be, but if it was adopted on a more consistent basis, I think that's where I would like to see it, because then to me, it would be providing more opportunities to more students. And you know, the more students we can educate, the more positives we have for our future, you know, society. So I would like to see, you know, more widespread esport participation. Understanding with anything, it's going to take a little while to grow, and we'll have some growing pains, but it's not going anywhere. So let's take advantage of that.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I think that starts with the core foundation, you know, the younger age groups having an understanding of how to do it correct, you know, eliminating toxicity, creating diversity, learning what it is to compete at a high level for esports, et cetera. So, Caroline, I sincerely appreciate you taking a moment just to really help us understand a little bit more on the space. Certainly wish you the very best as we hopefully start to get to a little bit of normalcy with COVID-19 and everything else and get back on campus little by little. We'll love to check back in with you, see how the fall semester starts to treat you guys. Hopefully you'll have some live in-person events that we can kind of check in on. And certainly we wish you all the best as we progress. So appreciate it. Thank you so much.